is there a sense here that this, I guess we call it a slowdown, if we will, right now, is that temporary, or is this more of a structural shift in how we're buying phones overall?
Thank you. Thanks for having me. So absolutely. And I think I was hearing your conversations earlier. There's definitely, Apple came a long way, right? They had a very strong record-breaking year in 23. So certainly this year, there's been some challenges. We talked about China. We've talked about it many times. But also this year, right, there's been multiple things happening. The growth, the refresh cycles continue to grow. And so growth has been pretty flat in the developed markets, which are still, the macro challenges still remain. But the bigger, reason for the dent has really been the increased competition that Apple saw in China. So it was still number one in Q4, but it did see, a drop about 5% or 4% globally and about 10% in China. So that all amounted to a pretty flat, like we're showing about a roughly 1% decline for Apple in 2024, but it still, made it to the top.
Well, that raises the question, too, as to whether Apple has lost some of the pricing power, because that was always kind of the ace that it had up its sleeve, that it could pretty much put any price tag on these iPhones and people would pay them. We saw that with the release of the 16 and even to the 15, where those price increases were not quite as dramatic as what we saw in the past.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. Apple's selling price has increased. If it was like in the mid 800s, about five years ago in 2019, and now it's well above $1,000. And year over year, we kept seeing, ASPs grow, and still consumers were buying it, kind of riding that premiumization trend, right? But this year, of course, there's a big release with the iPhone 16, a lot of, excitement around Apple Intelligence, but there's been mixed reviews, right? Like you said in the segment earlier, there hasn't still that groundbreaking, like actual assistant that could do we could just talk to do multiple tasks for us. So imagine you're driving and you're able to say, hey, find the next concert of so-and-so for me and buy the tickets and put it on my calendar and send an invite. That's not happening yet. So that's really, remains to be seen. And that's when we think things will pick up once that grows.
Let's just focus on China for a moment here, because Mark Gurman, who's our Apple reporter here at Bloomberg, notes that Apple grew in every region outside of China. So every single market, Apple saw growth except for China. And this is even after analysts have noted some incremental discounting for iPhone 16s in that country. Greater China revenue for Apple in the first quarter was $18.5 billion when analysts were looking for $21.5 billion at least. So, Nabila, my question to you is, when you look at the offerings from a Huawei or a Xiaomi, does Apple just need a different strategy for China, a different approach to this market than what it's doing for the rest of the world?
So, you already see them changing their approach. And traditionally, Apple would never really play into the hands of like large discounts or big promotions, but they are changing. They're realizing that in order to compete in a market like China, they really have to, change their approach. So they're giving big promotions, discounts, but also it's a bigger issue than that, right? Yes, competition is increasing, but also consumer psyche and mindset is changing, where they're looking for more deals, more value driven. They're not lining up outside the store, whichever launch it may be, to buy the new device because of these incremental changes that we're seeing. But we're hoping that, next year, or hopefully this year, as Apple solidifies a partnership with the AI models, local AI models in China, that we might be able to see some better growth this year.
Is the lack of Apple Intelligence and AI offerings the reason why Apple may not be able to gain traction in China? I mean, I hear about reports where Chinese consumers are looking to homegrown brands because of nationalism, because of those reasons, as opposed to wanting to buy another U.S. product. And then you also have, of course, Chinese government offices ensuring that people who work there use a Chinese phone as opposed to an Apple phone.
So the government issue has not really dented because the proportion of iPhone sales in China there's not a large proportion that leads to those government sales, but it's really the consumer sales that are driving. And yes, increased competition from Huawei, as well as a lot of the other brands, because if you look at the China data, you'll see that Pretty much, Huawei, Xiaomi, Vivo all grew by strong double digits, but Apple, had a decline. So consumers are looking for, those brands are really targeting multiple, much lower price segments. Also, with the exception of Huawei, they're having multiple launches, many different products, a lot of deals, and so Apple is trying to, compete by offering the kind of promotions that it has. I think the most recent one was the highest ever that it has done. It was about a $500 discount, right, for the latest lineup.
There's been a lot of talk, Nabila, about this idea, sort of longer term, that the traditional phone, I guess traditional modern phone, I should say, that we use, that could be a thing of the past. I mean, obviously, there's been a lot of talk about whether it's glasses or watches or other types of wearables, but the idea of just having that computer in our hand the way we do now could change. And I do wonder that when we get to that inflection point, are there companies out there that you've been tracking that maybe have an advantage in moving to that space and away from the traditional handset?
I think all of the smartphone makers are now looking where, what different form factor they can expand to or, change. We saw obviously a little bit of a change with the foldables, but really that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about a completely different device, right? Be it something that you wear, the glasses, or another kind of wearable. But honestly, at this point, for the near long term, I don't see the primary form factor changing. But I think all the smartphone makers are investing in these different devices. I think we saw some teasers from a couple of the brands as well in the last weeks. And so, I think they're all just waiting. But as of now, the smartphone does remain the primary computing device for most consumers.